All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with the panel discussion. Hi, everyone. Brian Macdonald. You might have seen me introduce myself earlier today, but I'm currently at Yale. And with me on the panel here, we have Emily Wright from Volleyball Canada, Paul Sabin from University of Pennsylvania, Sean Ahmed from the Pittsburgh Pirates and New Haven, Connecticut. Sean Fisher from Cincinnati Reds. So we got, what is that? 1/3 of the panel is Sean's. I don't know why. I should have just moved on. So Cincinnati. And then we have Luke Benz at Harvard. And so I'm not going to read their full bios. They can, because the first question is basically sort of about their backgrounds and stuff. So I just kind of wanted to start. This panel is basically about different careers in sports and also different paths to either a career in sports or working on sports analytics in some way if it's not the main career. We good with audio video?
All set. I was just
okay.
So if you were in the shop before.
Oh, okay. All right. I can scooch over. So I guess I kind of just wanted to start just by hearing a little bit about the career paths of everyone, including like what kinds of stuff did you like to do in high school and college or junior high or before you even knew analytics, sports analytics was actually a thing? What kinds of stuff did you like to do? Did that inform what you studied in college and so on? So what were your passions, I guess, growing up as a kid? No order. We're not going down the line. I'll say that now. We're not going down the line. Just
you just said we're not going down the line. So.
I'll go. Fine. All right. I love sports growing up, but as you can tell, I was very muscular as a kid as well. So always tall and skinny. And so in a certain point in high school, being a 3-point shooter but getting knocked around in football, had its limits. And I knew that I wasn't going to play collegiate or anything in sports. And so I was good at math and always enjoyed that. But I remember taking calculus in high school and I was like, math isn't as fun as like the other math where you you actually do stuff that like is real world problems. In other math classes, they would give you like word problems, right? And so I realized, I like applied stuff. People always told me that I should do engineering because my mom was like, it's 4 years, then you get a good job, and it's like an applied math. And then I went to an engineering class. I left midway through the first day, and signed up to do statistics. So, I always have just loved sports. I always, as a kid, would pay attention to like the box score stuff, which, is ironic because now we rail against box scores for a living. But anyways, that's sort of my path. I studied statistics, and whenever I had a problem or like an opportunity to pick a project in a class to apply a method that we were learning, I, instead of doing probably more useful work like studying, cancer or other actual helpful things in the world, I enjoyed sports. So I always picked a sports problem instead.
My story is pretty similar to Paul's in that there was definitely a point where I realized not going to be playing baseball, football, basketball. I'm going to run. That's my skill. So I ran in high school, I ran in college. And that was like what I did to engage with sports mostly. I grew up a fan of the big New England teams, and followed them, but math was never my favorite subject in school, somewhat ironically now. But when I got to college, I wanted to study literature, signed up for that major. And somebody was like, sort of similar, you might want a job that pays you some money. And they're like, why don't you, they were like, you're not bad at math. Just go. It's different than high school. Like, go do that. And so I double majored in literature and math, and then went to grad school in a completely unrelated field. But that let me get a lot more exposure to statistics, hands-on, and gave me the opportunity to do research and projects, and some of which I eventually just started moving into that. Like, I'm going to do them about sports. I'm going to do them about sports, away from the social sciencey part of it. And eventually that became independent projects. The independent projects turned into job applications. Enough job applications turned into a job, which is, the goal.
I'm happy to go next. I don't think my story is all that much different. I think I very quickly, around the 8th or 9th grade, saw 3 curveballs and realized that I wasn't gonna, make the major leagues or anything like that. And I guess like I sort of had a similar experience where I saw proofs for the first time in college, and I said, this math, which I had liked a lot in high school, all of a sudden seems like a waste of time. It seems like you do something and it lives on a blackboard, and like, who really cares about this stuff? And if you do that, like, all the more power to you. It's hard, and I'm sure that it's important in some context that I'm yet to figure out. But I instead sort of learned, like, statistics is this toolbox that you can apply towards problems in any area that you're interested in. So for me, sports has been one of those things, and kind of medicine and public health has been another. But I think that that's my favorite part about statistics and data science more generally. It's really hard to ever get bored, because if you get bored of the problem that you're working on, the skills are so transferable. You can just work on a different problem. And thankfully, I have yet to get bored by working on problems in sports. But that's sort of my path there.
I can dovetail somewhat off that. Well, to start from how I first got interested, I always wanted to work in baseball. I remember the day when I was 5 years old when I fell in love with baseball, going to a game at Tiger Stadium for a friend's birthday, and was obsessed with it ever since. Not at all from an analytical end. It predated Moneyball by some 15 years, or at least when Moneyball was set. And I went to school at the University of Chicago. I got an economics and a Latin American studies minor, was the latter, and I called that my baseball major. And I just did a lot of things in a lot of different ways, writing about baseball, working with the baseball team, and just otherwise learning and taking stuff I was interested in. And my first path into the game was actually writing about baseball, working in-house publications with the Chicago Cubs. And it wasn't until about 6 years after that that I was directly using, let's say, the quantitative economics part. So I've always known I wanted to work in baseball, and always taken steps towards doing that. And it wasn't until kind of later that a lot of the pieces came together.
I wasn't planning on it. Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. So as if it wasn't obvious, and if you haven't heard me say it 100 times, I am Canadian. I grew up on the east coast of Canada in a really small town. And if you've ever grown up in a small town, you know that there's absolutely nothing to do. So I basically played every sport under the sun, and I was also kind of, there's different terms for it, whether it's boy, daughter, or your father's son. I was the son of the family, so I kind of like did all the sports my father played. We watched sports together, yada, yada, yada. So that's how I got into sports growing up. I went on and played provincially, and then I went and played volleyball in university. I studied pure math when I was in university. Kind of coincided with like COVID happening, retirements, injuries, and I actually kind of took, I guess, a different turn than most, where I hated sports. I didn't want to touch them. I didn't want to go anywhere near them for like 3 or 4 years. And I went and did my master's in Montreal, and I took a sports analytics course, and it was kind of finally that like, okay, like I like sports again, but it was also my first official mix of like, oh, there's a sports side and there's like a math side to my life, and I can kind of join them if I so choose. So yeah, that answered the question, right? Okay.
Good answer. Good answer. Yeah, I mean, so some of you touched on this already, but like just curious. So some different paths, although everyone was interested in sports, I guess, at a young age, not surprisingly, was expecting that answer. But lots of different paths, and also what you're doing now is different for a lot of people. So we have people that are in academia, people who are in the sports industry, some people work for teams, some who don't work for teams, some who used to work in media, and so lots of different choices there. So curious, of the things that you sort of just talked about as far as like your passions, and so forth growing up, what made you choose to go into sports or stay in academia or go sports to academia or back and forth a bunch of times? That's me, I guess. Not you, but you went back and forth once, I guess. And work for a team versus not for a team, so on. Just talk about what sort of made you choose your current, the job that you're currently in. No, can't go in the same order, Paul.
So I went to grad school for communication. I have a doctorate effectively in political communication. I started that in August of 2016, which if you're versed in recent American history was a hell of a time to be like, yeah, let me study US political partisanship, especially in online media. It was like, it was a tough few years. People weren't that happy. But it was really, it was interesting. It was informative. Like it was a great experience, but it was challenging, right? Like there are topics in a lot of I'm speaking from a social science fields that can be really rewarding. You can do a lot of work, but make very little impact. And I actually, when I finished up grad school, my first job out was with a federal contractor doing evaluation work on the federal government's COVID vaccination public health campaign, which again, a little bit different, very impactful, but like 10 times as depressing. And so hit a point where I was like, I can't keep doing this. I do love sports. Like the goal is always sort of to be in sports. And the sports sort of became this opportunity to be like, the parts I like of my job, the things I've done over the last 5 years were data, analysis, research, communication. Sports was the way to do that without it being, how do you click on this ad? How do you study political partisanship in the United States at a time when it is not good, or COVID at the time? And then we went 62 and 100 the first season. So rocky first year, but we rebounded, and now it's much more fun.
This is a quick follow-up question. So you said you studied political communication in particular.
Yes.
What from that, I can imagine that would potentially be useful. Is there anything in particular that you really use a lot now that you're doing sports analytics and need to communicate with people at your team? Because there's sort of not exactly political parties within an organization, but there are sometimes different camps.
No, it's a good question. Luckily, people usually don't fracture quite so extremely. The nice part about grad school in communication is you actually study very little about how to communicate. So in terms of like, this is a good strategy, this isn't a good strategy. But so there's a lot of methodological, you're doing all this stuff that you bring to your job from the stat side. But I do think the like takeaways of just like, it does help you set some perspective setting to come in and be like, we're not arguing about whatever the political issue of the moment is. We're arguing over how often should we have Ellie De La Cruz try to steal bases? Like you come with some perspective of just like, is this the hill I want to die on? Or is this something where I can step back, sort of go, yep, I hear you. Let me like not get, I wouldn't say not too invested, but not too maybe emotionally defensive of everything. Cause you're like, nope, I've seen that side of it. And like, this is a thing that is supposed to be hard but fun.
To the question about choosing, industry or team or not, I think it's always been pretty obvious to me that I wanted to work for a team, and it's only become increasingly so. Though I will say that there are a lot more interesting paths in sports, either academia or interesting companies like Paul's worked for, Sumer Sports. There's so many options now, which is great, whatever your path is. For me, a few things. One, I realized I really like impacting a team, seeing a project directly to the stakeholder, communicating with those stakeholders, trying to anticipate their needs and seeing the impact on the field. And when you win, it only becomes increasingly, intoxicating and exciting to be part of that. And even now, as I think about, previously I was with the Chicago Cubs for 6 years in R&D, and now at the Pirates, it was really to me about wanting for my second team to go through a build, and it's most fun when it manifests in winning. It wouldn't be worth it otherwise, but I enjoyed that build. I enjoy when you do win, looking around at your teammates, the people who have done it along with you, and thinking we did this together, and sometimes, with that kind of naive optimism that you can. So for me, it's always been pretty obvious that a team is my path, and maybe I'm interested about others because there's a lot of other more interesting ways than there used to be now.
I feel like I've done everything that you haven't done. Which is I've worked for ESPN for 7 years, so I'm local here to Connecticut from that time, and so a sports media company, and I had a really annoying boss for about a year and a half, 2019 to 2020. Just kidding. And worked for Sumer Sports, which is like a third-party company that we worked directly with NFL teams, and now I'm back in academia. So for me, my life choices have always kind of been, one, the job at ESPN. It was a dream. Like I tell people, like, as a kid, I watched SportsCenter every day. I know kids don't do that anymore, right? Media has changed. You can like look up who won the game on your phone, why would you want to watch an hour of TV just to figure out who won a game? But that's how it used to be. And so, it was a dream, like working at ESPN, seeing the work that I did show up on TV. Had its downsides, like, being at dinner and realizing that like something my model spit out doesn't look right, and seeing it on the TV behind me, at the bar at the restaurant, So, there's downsides as well. But I've always kind of, for me, try to prioritize like sports jobs with work-life balance. And although I haven't worked for a team, from the many conversations I've had with people that do, that's sometimes harder to have a stable 9 to 5 for a team, because teams don't play in between 9 and 5 during the day usually, unless it's baseball and it's like twice a week they do that. But so that's what's kind of led me to different things here. But I'm the type of person who always likes to stay intellectually curious, and so I've been fortunate to have things have challenged me every step of the way, and I would always encourage people to not get complacent and always be learning, no matter what you do.
So Sean and Sean, work-life balance. Any thoughts?
It is better than it used to be in my observation. It's definitely, I'm sure, compared to a lot of other jobs and industries, not the same. When I was in my time with the Cubs, I was probably in the office 330 out of 365 days. And I told that to a friend's coworker spouse at one point. She thought I was crazy until I listed off, well, there's Thanksgiving, there's all these other, holidays or something like that, because she thought I was like too low in my estimate. So their work-life balance was really bad in a lot of ways. I didn't actually always mind it myself. I was all in on what it was, but it obviously has a ton of downsides, is exclusionary in a lot of ways, and probably long-term not great. Now, one of the there's at least in baseball, the relentless pace of the schedule has not changed, and the fact that there's different baseball milestones, draft season, off season, trade deadline, all that, are constantly ongoing. So you can't escape kind of the year-round part of it within baseball. But as our teams have grown, there's more redundancy. There's more opportunity for people to, especially in like research and development, to kind of sprint when inspired and then step back at other times, or kind of take secondary roles on things, work more on specific projects as opposed to everything. So I think this has gotten a lot better. I've had in the last month a couple people take 1 to 2 week trips, and that's as a season starting and stuff like that, and it hasn't brought down the team, and most people really kind of embrace and cherish that all the way up to our GM. So all improving.
In fact, it seems like it made the team better.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Don't want to know what happens when yeah, exactly.
I don't have quite the same over time sense, but I agree with what you're saying about currently. Most teams have larger and larger investments in analytics, R&D. The more people you have, the easier it is to take time off and step away and feel like the world isn't going to fall while you're not there, because your teammates will help pick you up and support you. And I think that's a huge thing. I think there's a lot of basically, at the Reds, I guess it sounds like at the Pirates too, there is a culture of like, hey, you need to like, your job shouldn't be your 100% life, right? And like when that's the priority, when people from all the way at the top down are saying that, it actually helps, it lets me go to the people I work with and say, hey, we just pushed through whatever project. We spent 4 months on it. It was a big deal. We did crunch probably. We probably put some extra time in. Hey, if you need to like, this is the window to be flexible. And we try to find that, identify it. It is not the same as like a normal 9 to 5, billable hours situation or anything like that. There are days that are very long.
Luke, you want to talk sort of, I guess, answering the previous question, getting back to that, but you could also talk about work-life balance being a PhD student, because I imagine there might not be, it might not be great.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm the right one to ask on that. Yeah. No, to your original question, I think like a fair question for me is, why don't I have a job in sports right now? And, is that something I eventually want to do? I think that's a question I ask myself a lot. Why, like, I didn't pursue a full-time career in sports right out of undergrad, say, is I have other interests as well. And I think the thing about sports, which is becoming, bigger and bigger, is that there's ways to contribute in it without it being your full-time job. And I'm not so sure that that's always true in other industries. Like if I have interests in kind of medicine or public health, and I think that, doing a full-time job in sports and would kind of require me to give up that part of my passion. I'm fortunate enough that some of the research that I do as part of my PhD can be on sports analytics. I work as a consultant for the Ivy League on problems related to scheduling and tiebreakers. And so I think that kind of scratches the itch of, doing meaningful work in sports analytics while kind of maintaining my other hobbies. But that's not to say that, it's not still something that I think about and consider. And, I'm kind of fortunate that I have a little bit of time left before I have to get a job full time. But that I think that, even as someone up here on the panel, it's like an ongoing debate for me. So it shouldn't be like a scary thing if some people out there are having the same kind of thoughts.
If you had to estimate the probability, academia versus industry, what would it be right now? And has that changed over time? Can you sketch a line, a academia probability chart behind you?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that it's like probably pretty low, and I think that it's kind of funny. I knew going into my PhD that I didn't want to be like a professor. I think there's a
No
lot of
offense.
things I like about academia and doing research, and I think actually a lot of those same qualities are kind of the fun things that I would find appealing about working in a sports team, right? You kind of work on intellectually stimulating problems. There's not always a right or clear answer. I think that, like any job, but particularly I think in academia, there's a lot of red tape. So I think that whatever I end up wanting to do, it will kind of maximize doing research, working on intellectually stimulating problems, having really good collaborators from diverse backgrounds. I've actually found that every team that I've been a part of has had people from kind of different paths to get there, and those have been the most fun and most productive teams that I've been on. And whether that's in sports or some kind of like industry research setting, I guess TBD, but that's sort of the function that I'm trying to maximize right now.
Cool. Emily.
I was last twice, just so you're aware.
You can be first next.
Oh, okay. So, I guess my career path so far is pretty short. But this might be kind of relatable at least. Was nearing like the end of grad school. I wasn't really sure if I wanted to do a PhD. And I kind of had that like enough time. I just finished, like I said, I took a sports science course. I found it really interesting. I finished it and had enough time, but was also kind of like, okay, I need to find a job probably. And I gave myself, I guess, kind of like a little window of like, okay, I want to try and see if I can do something in sports. And if I can't find it, okay, well, then I'll switch gears and just try to find a job in general to pay the bills. And I say I got lucky, and ended up getting a job in the window, but got hired still while I was in grad school at Volleyball Canada, and I've basically been there since. And they were great, kind of letting me finish out grad school while also working for a little while. But yeah, do you want me to comment on work-life balance at all? Or?
Yes.
Okay. So I work for a governing body of sport. We call them like national sport organizations, so NSOs. We had, this is like an aside, sorry, what we call High Performance Summit, which is kind of just like comparing for like high performance sports. And we just did one within Volleyball Canada, so like beach, indoor, and sitting. And they made this joke of like in high performance sport, there's like a ledge or a peak. And on one side of the peak, there's like a valley that's like home, and on the other side, it's like work, and that we always struggle to kind of sit equally in the middle. Sometimes we're heavy into one, and sometimes we're heavy into the other. I work with the beach teams. We have 11 months of the year we are in season. We have 20 athletes, teams within a teams, and there's like no off season. Like I basically feel like I have teams in Guadalajara right now where it's just like there's something going on at all moments in time. I feel worse for our coaches where it's like they have a lot more going on, and they don't necessarily have the flexibility that what we call our integrated support team would have. So there are times where it's not great. Paris is probably going to be one of them. But there are times where we try to kind of like capitalize on those like lower moments where it's like Easter weekend, we do the same with our athletes. We give our athletes like a longer Easter weekend, in turn also taking the longer Easter weekend for ourselves, to kind of like even that out a little bit. I would also say that Olympic sports are a lot, Elliot can probably agree with me, a lot poorer than like professional sports teams. So sometimes we can be worn thin, which isn't fun. But it kind of comes with the territory, I guess, of like working in Olympic sport.
I mean, besides the fact that I'm shocked that you can play beach volleyball in Canada for 11 months. But
we have indoor courts.
Okay. No, I was going to say, one of the things.
When it's nice.
Okay. So
Snow
in
volleyball.
July.
Snow volleyball.
I'm teasing. I am a dual Canadian citizen. So, but I was going to say around work-life balance. One thing I struggled with for a long time was sports was like a huge hobby of mine. Sports analytics, like, it was a huge hobby, and then it became a career. And then I was like, what's my hobby? Right? Because like everything I did, which used to be my hobby and used to be fun, like I personally don't believe in the, well, if you love your job, you never work a day in your life slogan, because it's still a job. Like, and although I did have, good bosses at ESPN, despite me joking earlier, like, it's still a job. You still have to answer to people. You still have deadlines. You still have things to do. And all those things cause stress. Even if you love like the actual work, there's still stress involved. And so, what some of you have also said is that, it's really important to have other hobbies. Like, if you want to work in sports, that's awesome, and I encourage everyone to do that. But don't let that be like your only hobby or your only passion, because then you won't have any left when it's your full-time job.
This is, I guess, kind of tagging on, sorry. That like I played growing up, so like I play in an indoor rec league, like a retired person that I am. And I have friends that are and I have friends that are like, oh my God, like you never talk about your job, you never talk about your job. But I don't tell anybody when I go to these things, like what I do or where I work or anything, because it's kind of that me trying to give a divide of like, this is me, this is my personal life. I'm gonna keep my day job out of it. Just to give that kind of like divide, even though they are related. Like I said, it's basically the same kind of thing. But yeah, trying to keep them separate sometimes is hard. Sometimes you feel like you're keeping secrets, but it's really just to give yourself like your own little personal like sanity, I guess. Sorry.
You go incognito to the volleyball court.
Yeah, don't wear any gear, like nothing.
The only thing I was going to add on to it, actually, a lot of that resonated, and I suppose I do have hobbies outside of baseball, but for me, one thing I actually have really liked about working baseball, and I am someone who thinks about honestly baseball all the time, is there is a lot of variety within the sport, and I do think like your job, if you're looking to work in sports, you can also seek variety within your role. And not every role would probably be equal, but for us, research and development in baseball season, you go from thinking about off-season moves and player evaluation and deeper research to getting ready for a season, communicating a lot with stakeholders, educating people, implementing things, to the amateur draft where you're thinking about 18-year-olds and 21-year-olds as opposed to fully mature major leaguers, player development and things like that. So that is not sufficient variety for everyone. Like that might resonate with some of you and not others, but I do think that's something that like really keeps baseball and research and development like very lively to me. If I had to do one exact sort of project every day, for a year, I probably would wear out very fast and not find it so novel all the time.
So some of you sort of touched on this. We were talking about pros and cons and stuff like that. But I was curious if there's anything that you really miss or you feel like you're missing out on with your current job. Do you have FOMO about anything, or do you ever do you think that at some point in the future you will want to change your career? It might be hard to answer if maybe you don't want to talk about it publicly, I guess, if you're currently like looking for a team or something. But like I sort of I asked because I knew when I went into the sports industry that I would eventually go back to academia because I really like teaching, and so I didn't know if it would be 5, 10 years, 20 years or whatever, but I knew I would go back eventually. So I'm just curious if there's anything like that with any of you. And Luke has a fixed decision coming up, so you already kind of talked about that, but I'm curious, if anyone else has sort of thought about this, you have FOMO about other career paths, regrets, things like that.
I'll respond quickly and pass off the mic. Big time FOMO guy all the time. And I want to work in baseball the next 30 years. I was really influenced by one of my former bosses at the Chicago Cubs, Theo Epstein, who put a timeline on himself, 10 years with the team. And I myself, in research and development. Specifically, it was 6 years with the Cubs, but then, it was about 10 years total with them across roles. And I think there's something to that. When you go somewhere else, you create new things, you have to create new connections. That's revitalizing. It tests you in new ways. And so that's for me how I, in part, seek variety.
I was gonna say, when I was at ESPN, one of the things I felt like I had FOMO of is that, it was awesome in the sense that like we worked on different sports, and so like I got to do football projects, I got to do basketball projects, I did a very, very little hockey project one time. But I got to do a few soccer, different things. But then I always felt like when I would go to conferences, I'd be like, oh my gosh, look at this awesome stuff that like this person who gets to spend 100% of their time thinking about just one sport, how like smart they are about it, or all the like new things that are being done. And I'm just like running around like a chicken with his head cut off, trying to keep up with like 5 different sports at once. And so then of course my next job, it was like football. And, so there's pros and cons to both, right? But like that's one thing I've always kind of struggled with. It's like it's fun because I love all sports, right? Some more than others, but I do love all sports. And so it was fun to work in all of them, but at the same time I was like, oh, but like I'm also feeling like I'm never caught up.
I feel like I probably have a few FOMOs, but again, I get FOMO about everything. I am also like never one to like close a door. I love chatting. I love whatever. So I'm always up like for new things or whatever, and like that aspect of the world. But FOMO, I feel like is definitely one. I'm always like, oh, I want to do this and this and this and this and this. And then I always get we don't have the budget for that. So that one's always kind of like a hard pill to swallow. And then FOMO.
All right, great. So why don't we open it up to the audience to ask some questions of our panelists. And we'll pass the mic around because this is being broadcast over Zoom. So we'll just ask you to wait until you get a mic to ask your question. So quickly.
Looks like we're in a police line.
Yeah,
Like
kind of
against the
has.
light back.
It makes me think of
Hey, so I know when you normally like think about like your interactions with sports, you think of it as like a hobby or something you do for fun. How has like working in sports changed the way you view the sport you work in? Like, can you still like work in that sport, or can you still like, I guess like watch it for fun in your leisure time, or has that kind of changed?
I feel like I sort of kind of answered this already, but it's like yes and no, right, to both of those. Like I said, like I watched the least amount of ESPN of my life during the 7 years I worked there. Because like, yeah, I would watch, and when I would watch, it would be to be like, okay, how are the anchors using the model that I built, and are they using it correctly? And like that's a work question, and it's like, okay, like Scott Van Pelt, like good job, or oh, maybe I should send an email to your researcher so they can explain this to you better. But at the same time, right, like I still love sports, right? And it's like it's not like I wouldn't watch like the NBA finals or something just because they would show our probabilities before the game. Like, I would still watch, but it was a little bit more stressful knowing that like, oh, like if I did something and it gets on TV, which is awesome because I remember the first time that happened too, and I was like, oh my gosh, like I called everyone I knew, like, look at this. I like took a screenshot, and like this, like I did this. But yeah, so it's like it's a mixed bag. Like, yes, it is work, so it's a little bit different experience than it used to be, but you can still enjoy it. It's like you have to pick your battle sometimes. At least that's my experience.
Yeah, that moment's exciting when it works and the fielder's not in the wrong spot. A few things maybe change. One is the sport's way more complex, and the inside decision-making machinations are more complex than even a lot of like analytically forward analysis fully realizes. and probably for good reasons and problematic bad reasons. But that's one big thing. A second thing, you might not watch games in their entirety anymore. You might be working during a game. You might be catching the first few innings and then turn into something else. So that if that nature of enjoying the sport is a little bit different. You might be truly watching it through a spreadsheet or video or watching multiple games at a time. Trying to think. I think those would be a couple things. I might missing something else.
I think that that's like a pretty fair way, though, of like when you're working for a team in particular, you know, you're going to see a lot of game footage. You're going to see the game in a lot of different ways. But I would emphasize, and I would assume it's somewhat similar, like when a guy hits a ball really, really far, it's really, really fun still. Like it doesn't matter where you're like, I understand that this is a problem of exit velocity or whatever, you know, StatCast, however they want, but you're like, he hit ball far. That's very cool. Which is partly like some selection into like why you work in the sport. If that's still really enjoyable, no matter how many hours in a week you spend thinking about how do we do this more often.
I did remember just one thing I would add. One of the things I've actually enjoyed the most about being attached, and you can do this with your own research as well, or as you put out names, if you're not working with the team, is seeing whatever's black and white in the moment of a decision or a player being better than another, how gray it becomes later is, I think, a fascinating part about just making this your on, constant thing, that it just never is so linear or clear. And that's the learning process. That's actually what I've enjoyed the most and how I've evolved the most, is watching how results are never quite what you thought at the time. And you kind of keep adapting to that.
You want to? I was going to say, one of the most interesting things is when you work in sports and you watch games, is the internal struggle in your soul of like, oh, like that was awesome, but I know that was a stupid thing for that player to do. Or maybe it wasn't a bad decision, but like that was still awesome because like the ball went in, or like it was a home run, or like he probably shouldn't have swung at that pitch, but like, hey, he hit it out of the park. Awesome. Right. And you're always kind of like having that internal debate of like enjoying the sport versus like analyzing it at the same time.
I feel like my answer is probably really different. I grew up playing indoor. I played indoor in university, and now I work for the beach teams. And although I played beach like recreationally, I wouldn't say I played it as competitive as the athletes. So like you'd watch it in Tokyo, or I'd watch it in Tokyo, but that was the extent of it. So then now I feel like watching like just beach volleyball in general is part of my job, because I didn't really watch it leisurely before. But I also work, I don't know how closely you guys work with like athletes, but I work with the athletes close enough that I know them and I know them fairly well. So I try to like, I guess, wear both hats, where it's like I'm watching the game and yes, I'm thinking about all the things going on at work, but I'm also trying to remember that like I know these people are human and I know them like as people, and I want them to succeed, even if it isn't necessarily kind of what the game plan was going in. So you're like kind of cheering for them on one hand and hoping everything goes well and they win. And yeah, it's kind of, again, I guess, an internal battle while you're watching it. Yeah, I think that's all I have to add. Oh, but I watch other sports, and I feel like when you don't work in other sports, it's a lot easier to be like leisure about it. Yeah.
So this was kind of just touched on a bit, but kind of a two-part question is, one, not on a very serious note, what is it like watching the sport that you work in with friends that don't work in the industry? And two, with your coworkers, do you still have like sport conversations that are super like non-analytical and just like, oh, I think LeBron's the GOAT because he is?
I guess I'll go. Okay, the first one is, as much as I love my family, I find my family the most annoying to watch with, because they start asking questions about like the player's specific, what's their name? And I'm just like, okay, just watch the game. But yeah, sometimes I feel like when I'm watching with like friends or something, I try to think of it as like more of a pastime instead of like work. So I try to just keep that part away from me. Yeah, sometimes they'll ask questions, but like try to keep it minimal. And then also just like if I don't want to answer it or I don't want to talk about it, I'm like, yeah, I can't talk about it. Even if I'm just kind of not in the mood. And the second part of the question was somebody remind.
Emotional debate, right?
Oh, we have a lot of athletes and coaches that are super big into betting, and I'm really not at all into the betting world. And sometimes they'll be like, "Oh, tell me who's gonna do X, Y, and Z," and I'm like, this one. And I just like spit it out just because that's what I was feeling in the moment. And I tell them that I'm like, don't take my word for it, but like this is my guess. Sometimes I'll verify and give them whatever if they want, sure. But yeah, sometimes I'll contribute to those like debates. Like the recent one was March Madness. So they play March Madness in the weight room when they're working out, and they're like always watching something. So like sometimes I'll come in and just chime in, even though I probably know nobody's name or know some names, but not everybody's name in college basketball. And I'll just like make a comment and just to stir the pot almost, and then like leave. So then they kind of like have this big debate, which is kind of funny. But so yeah, sometimes I guess. I mean, everybody likes to shoot the shit a little bit, so I feel like you do it just for fun. Oh, sorry.
Please no swearing.
I say I love my father, but watching sports with him has become unbearable as an adult. So it's just things like, you know, he'll complain. My dad actually watches. He likes to ref, and so he actually watches the officials sometimes over the actual game itself, which just in general is really annoying. But second is, you know, he'll complain about decisions, and I'll be like, well, like, but actually that like is kind of optimal now. Like, I know we didn't used to do it that way, but like it wasn't optimal then, and it's still not optimal now to do what you want to do. But he, you know, I don't want to get into the whole debate because, you know, we're a stubborn bunch and no one will ever yield. So I typically just keep my mouth shut and enjoy his company. So.
I would add getting younger family involved is a lot of fun. We watch Reds games with my nieces who are 4 and 3. So like the level of engagement is not that's suboptimal. It's like, I like him, he's fast. And you're like, yep, he's fast. And like, but like it creates those experiences. Like those are like, right. I think it's like those are the experiences, at least for me, that got me into sports. I was like sitting down and watching it with older family members who are just like, yeah, isn't it fun? And like when you can share that, and it takes you a little bit out of that, like the anxiety of like, I've put some work on the line here. It's nice.
Yeah, I'll just say like my my dad is kind of similar to Paul. You know, I think he's open-minded about trying to, you know, like we'll be watching some game and like he'll complain that in the NBA they shoot too many threes, and you know, I like sort of say, well, like a contested mid-range jumper, while aesthetically maybe more pleasing, is not a very good shot. And I think he listens, but it resonated with me what you said. Exactly.
I would say I have a son, and he always asks me, "Who's the best? Who's this? Is so and so better, or so and so better?" And I'm always, I mean, that also is like, I'm a statistician, so it's uncertain, and that's.
So from the academic side, so I'm a professor and I teach students, and I want to know a couple things. First question is, what statistics or data science skill do you think you use the most and would want someone who is entering your organization to know, like to have learned in graduate school or undergrad? And the second one is, I always have students ask me, how do I get into sports analytics or into make myself known so that I can get a job? So one of those two questions, and maybe they're related.
Stop speaking on this for a little bit. I don't know that there's one magic silver bullet skill. the ones I like to tell people are you should know SQL enough to like select from, where, group by, join. It's helpful. I forget what the tech survey this year was, but it's like every team has got some large SQL setup in Major League Baseball. I assume it's the same in every other sport. I assume it's the same at ESPN. So you need to be able to get your data. And then from there, I like to think of it as you need to know regression pretty well. You should know something probably a little bit more advanced than regression. So either machine learning, but causal inference based, like these are all really good advanced topics. Know something about that. The more school you do, I think the more you should know that advanced skill. And then communication, and that's data viz, not necessarily to the degree of like Greg's art contest at JSM, but it needs to be like coaches, if something doesn't look accessible, won't read it, right? Like, so if you're working for a team, it needs to meet some minimum standard. But also your writing, you need to be able to write about data and analysis in a way that is accessible, both to a technical audience, right? We write a lot of documentation, but also to non-technical audience. And you'll hear that about a lot of data science jobs, but it's really true in sports where I'll go from writing for my boss, who's a neuroscience PhD, to writing for guys who've played and coached baseball for 40 years. And those are two very different backgrounds, right? I can't write the same thing. I always say I'd love to pay him, to be a fly on the wall if somebody went in and talked about machine learning to David Bell. Like, it'd be an interesting conversation. As to getting a job, the biggest thing is to apply. You can do sports analytics without working for a team or ESPN. Luke is a great example. Like, do projects, but ultimately, if you want a job in the industry, talked to a few people today about this, right? There are 30 MLB teams. There's like, you multiply out by however many leagues you want to potentially work in American sports. Let's say on average, every team hires 2 people a year. That might be generous in some leagues and for some teams, in a bunch of different markets. That's not a lot of jobs every year. That's not a lot of jobs that are necessarily full time. The best chance you have is to keep doing those projects while applying. It could take a little while. I don't mean to be negative about it, but like, it might take a while. You just need to keep like persevering through that and continue applying.
Yeah, so I don't work for a team, so maybe I won't talk about what it takes to work for a team, but I think that I'll just echo the communication and data visualization part that Sean touched on. I think that, a common pitfall a lot of people fall into is, to spend like a lot of time working on some sophisticated model because that's what excites you and answers your question. And then like the data visualization is just something that you need. And like, you obviously understand it because you've spent, countless hours working on your project, but ultimately the person, whether you're working for a team or, just working at some other job in general, like the person who ultimately makes a decision based off of your project might look at that graph for 15 seconds. And if they can't sort of get the clean takeaway that you spent 4 months working on in those 15 seconds, you probably didn't spend enough time working on your data visualization. Or, you didn't like communicate the take home message effectively enough. And so I just think that like, don't overlook the importance of such a basic or like elementary data science skill because it's not like as sexy as, machine learning or some of these other like hot topics.
I'll echo the list already given is great. I don't really have too much to add. I feel like probably sport dependent, and correct me if I'm wrong. Anybody who knows the sport of volleyball knows it's kind of weird. It's probably similar to like, I find football hard to learn personally, but there's a lot of like intricate little weird details. And they do say every once in a while, I hear people say it doesn't matter if you know anything about the sport. I would say that's probably sport dependent and team dependent. When there's not too many in a department, I feel like knowing at least something about the sport is great. Like I said, volleyball is super niche, and then beach on top of it has a lot more intricacies. So like knowing those things can be very helpful. I'm sure might be similar in other sports. So that can help. And then I guess getting a job. I mean, the worst anybody can do or say to you is no, which to me really isn't that bad. So like, don't be scared to like put yourself out there, say hi, talk to people, request coffee chats, whatever. But if you're gonna like want to talk to somebody, I usually say like do a little bit of research on who you're talking to, get to know like them, their background, their path, what they went through, or ask them about it. And don't just come out flat and say like, hey, can I have a job? So like, and even sometimes don't even mention, you can just say, I just want to work in sport. I want to know how you got in there. That builds kind of like a foundation and a good network of like people in sports, so that, you know, either when you're ready or when something's available, maybe that you will be the first person they think of, or at least someone to be like, hey, I saw this job. I just wanted you to know that it was out there. So try to like build a good rapport and relationship with people, aside from like applying, obviously, but and hopefully that will help, I guess.
All right, that's unfortunately all we have time for. So let's give our panel a hand.